Yeah, I think the front-end developers will be really excited about this, or designers amongst us. So our next speaker is Ellie. Ellie is a developer with a passion for web performance, animations, and WebGL. And he actually works at Mapbox. Am I right? How many of you use Mapbox? It's very, okay. All right, so, and he's going to be talking about CSS at scale. CSS at scale. So, hey, Ellie.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see your screen. All right, so take it away.
So, functional CSS at scale, scaling CSS. It's, well, it's hard. Like, right? I mean, like, that's what they tell me. Like, I see these things pop up on my Twitter all the time, like Peter Griffin here struggling to adjust his CSS, or this pair of disembodied hands struggling to figure out their CSS puzzle, or this person dealing with some unexpected side effects. And I see these things all the time. But I want to know from you, like, who's lost time this summer debugging style issues? Raise your hand. Was it a lot of time? I see some nods. Well, for me, I've lost precisely 0 time debugging styles this summer. In fact, I've lost 0 time debugging styles in like the past year. And I know that that must sound very frustrating to have somebody up here telling you that they don't have a problem that seems to be so widespread. And I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to jump up on stage and tear down the projector like this angry panda here from, I think, like a cheese commercial or something. But hopefully I'll clue you into some of our secrets and turn you from an angry panda into a happy panda. So, hey, I'm Eli, and I'd like to talk to you about how we manage our CSS in Mapbox. Mapbox is a company that I work. I'm based out of Washington, D.C., but we're like in San Francisco and Berlin and Bangalore and other places too. And I work on mostly map design tools, like creating basically a big app that's Photoshopped for maps-ish. It lets designers and developers create beautiful, expressive, interactive maps. And I also do like front-end infrastructure stuff and cross-cutting concerns, performance, and things like that. I'm also really into creative coding. I started the Washington, D.C. creative coding meetup, the CodePen meetup, and I like to stay active in that community. And I make 3D art, animations, and games and stuff on the side. If you want to follow me on like Twitter or Dribble or CodePen or whatever, LinkedIn, I'm at Eli Fitch on like all the things. So this is the app that I work on day to day. This is Mapbox Studio. It's a really, really big, complicated app. It's got some, like a landing page right here, and we've got this big data set editor where you can like place points and lines and polygons and draw data and assign different properties to them and move them around. You can upload data and then change it. And then we've got this big style editor where you can create these like really different, interesting map styles like the one you see here. And this editor has an awful lot going on in it. Like there's a font thing where you can choose different fonts and apply them to the map. There's an icon customizer where you can pick different things and arrange them around. There's this complex curve editor where like you can make data properties on the map vary based in proportion to other properties and the zoom level at the same time. It's very crazy. We've got a formula editor where you can do like maths. We've got a code editor, and you can even do like data visualization stuff like creating heat maps and stuff like that. So this is exactly the type of big app that's been around for a long time where you'd expect the CSS to be this snarled, unmaintainable mess, and yet it's not. And the reason that it's not is down to the front-end framework that we use in-house at Mapbox that we call Assembly, which is primarily the work of developers David Clark, Katie Decora, Salman Bemel-Benrud, and Dana Sulit. And what makes Assembly cool and different and interesting is that it's organized around the architectural principle of functional CSS. If you're not sure what functional CSS is, but you've heard of atomic CSS, they are basically the same thing. I'm going to call it functional CSS because it's too easy to confuse atomic CSS with the atomic CSS library and atomic design and a whole bunch of other things. So functional CSS from here on out. And what is functional CSS? It's basically utility classes. Utility classes everywhere. Utility classes for everything, or at least as much as possible. And I know that this must sound kind of crazy, right? You've got this guy here telling you to use utility classes for everything, and I wouldn't blame you if you felt a little bit like Woody right now. But why don't I like hop in and show you what it looks like day to day so you can judge for yourself. So this is a component that we use in Mapbox Studio. I call it a link bar. It basically like appears in a list and you click this thing and it takes you to the style editor. And how link bar might look in a more traditional, normal BEM-like CSS framework would be something like this. You've got your link bar component, you've got like a call to action class, you've got your containers and icons, and like all of this looks pretty safe and pretty familiar to most people. How it looks with functional CSS and with assembly is like this. So we've taken that link bar class and deconstructed it into its little component pieces. Instead of having one class that encapsulates all these things, we have separate classes to define what the pointer looks like, to give it round corners, to give it a white background, to have margin and padding and flexbox definitions. And the same thing has been applied to all of its children. Each of these individual classes apply a single CSS rule that has a flat and relatively high specificity. And this is usually the point where people say no thanks. Where people say, well, functional CSS seems interesting, cool, not for me. There are a lot of misconceptions about functional CSS. So I think before we get into how it's really cool and how it can really help you scale your CSS, I want to address some of these misconceptions head on. I don't have time to address them all. There are a lot. So I'll just go after the top three, which is that it's too verbose and it's slow to write all those classes, that those classes are really weird and hard to read, and that it's basically just inline styles. So if inline styles are bad, therefore functional CSS must also be bad. So first, let's talk about verbosity. On the face of it, this is a pretty compelling argument. Like, this is a lot of classes to write over and over and over again. But the thing is, you don't actually want to deal with this amount of writing classes on a day-to-day basis. And you want to take this and abstract it behind a component system. Functional CSS is really only at its best when paired with some sort of component system. And I don't necessarily just mean React. You can use React or like Vue or Angular or any of the JavaScript-driven client-side component frameworks. But you can also use something as simple as template macros like you have here with Nunjux, which is how I have things in my own website. And then the next misconception is that these classes are really weird and really hard to read. It's kind of known for crazy class names. And that's just kind of something carried forward from functional programming of like really short, terse variables and composed functions. This is a bunch of classes from the Atomic CSS library. And I'll go ahead and read them now. Tebk vam p20pix. Like, I don't know what any of this means. This is legitimately really hard to read. This argument is kind of compelling to me. But here, let's compare Atomic CSS to assembly, which is what we use at Mapbox. We've got BGC hash something whatever and BG blue. So which of these is the blue button? Well, surprise, they're both the blue button. It just so happens that BGC hash something is a lot harder to read than BG blue. Basically, what I'm trying to say is functional CSS doesn't necessarily mean unreadable, weird, short, terse class names. That's just a choice that's been taken by a couple popular functional CSS frameworks and isn't a concept that's married to the architectural principle at all. And the next is you may as well just use inline styles, and inline styles are terrible, right? And this is also kind of, you know, on the face of it, makes sense. You've got this button that has each of these classes. These classes apply one rule, and these rules are like mapped one-to-one in this style definition. So these two things should be functionally equivalent, right? Well, sort of not. There are some key advantages that a functional CSS system offers you over just using inline styles. The biggest one is that it's aligned to your design system. So if you're just using inline styles with no guardrails at all, you could set, like, say, padding to whatever value you want. 7 pixels, 8.5, 8.75 pixels, 22, 3 Ms, whatever. Doesn't matter. You can choose whatever you want. Whereas with functional CSS, you'll only have a limited number of utilities that set padding to what has been decided by the folks who are creating your design system so that it helps you stay more consistent and keeps you on the rails. Next is that, like any CSS system, it offers some key features over inline styles like media queries, pseudo elements, and keyframes, without which I'm not sure you could create a successful CSS system. And finally, there's a non-trivial difference in rendering speed when you're dealing with really large, complex DOMs like you have with something like Matplox Studio. There's a non-trivial difference between the one-to-many relationship of a single CSS class to many elements versus a one-to-one relationship of a single inline style definition to each individual element. So hopefully you're feeling a little relieved right now that functional CSS isn't as crazy as you might have thought. And we can get into talking about how it's really, really, really good when you have to be concerned with scalability. How I want to make this argument is basically throw out some points that characterize scalable software in general and scalable CSS in particular, and then go through and see how functional CSS meets all of these qualifications. So number one, it's got to be performant. If as a system grows in size and complexity, it slows down, eventually it's just going to reach a point where it's completely unworkable. Next, it has to inspire confidence. If as a system grows more complex, people feel more and more fear or trepidation in working on that system, you'll reach a point where you just can't work on it efficiently anymore. Next, it has to isolate complexity. So if as a system grows in complexity, you have to deal with more and more and more complexity on a day-to-day basis, you're going to reach a point where you can't work on this effectively at all. Next, it has to be decoupled from as much as possible. If you make updates to one system and then have to make changes to a whole other related ecosystem of systems, that's not going to be very effective and it's not going to scale very well. And finally, it puts the many before the few in a team sense. It keeps barriers to entry low and turns people into productive contributors easily. So first, let's talk about performance. Performance is kind of probably what functional CSS is most known for. Even people who aren't fans of functional CSS will concede that it is really performant. And this is true. Like over time, functional CSS code bases tend to level out in size, whereas traditional code bases tend to grow in size. And this means that, and this is because functional CSS's core like superpower is that because you're just using this basket of little primitive utilities that you can compose together to create larger components, it means that you can create whole new user interfaces, new widgets, new elements, new whole pages without writing a single line of new CSS. You can write UI without writing CSS. And this shows up in the numbers and keeps file sizes small. Like Mapbox, we only have 79 kilobytes of CSS on our webpage. And like, I'm not throwing that out as like a great shining example. There's a lot of more performance optimizations we can do to get that number smaller. But when you stack it up against a site like Twitter, which has 630 kilobytes, starts to look pretty good. And it starts to look even better when you realize that you can create this big, complex, nested map styling user interface using the exact same style sheet that you used to create this fancy interactive landing page. They literally use the exact same style sheet, which means that you can leverage cross-product caching. Anytime you visit mapbox.com or documentation page or the account app or any of our web apps, as long as the other product that you're going to next uses the same version of assembly, that CSS file will already be cached and you won't need to request it again, which fulfills this promise where you can write CSS once and ship it over and over and over again in a very performant way. Next, it inspires confidence. So I want to tell you a joke. Two CSS properties walk into a bar stool and a completely different bar falls over. Like, ha ha ha, but this is kind of a terrible thing and reflects this kind of fear that people have that they can't be entirely sure that of the changes that they're making in the CSS will be applied in the way that they intend. And this fear means that instead of refactoring existing CSS or deleting existing CSS or modifying it, you just add more CSS on top of it, which increases the complexity, which means more fear for the next time, which means yet more complexity the time after that. And this cycle just runs over and over and over again in a loop. And that loop runs enough time, and eventually you'll reach the point where your CSS is completely unmaintainable and simply won't scale at all. Functional CSS addresses that by keeping CSS simple. Classes do one thing. So if you apply a class to an element, you can be absolutely sure that it will only do that one thing and won't have some other effect that you didn't intend. Classes are only scoped to the element that they're applied, which means that you can shuffle components around internally and put components inside of other components with absolute confidence without worrying that it'll create some unforeseen UI bug. And because all classes have the same flat and relatively high level of specificity, these classes are difficult to override by accident, and they play really well with third-party CSS. At the end of the day, what makes functional CSS good and what inspires confidence is it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's very simple. Kind of dovetailing with simplicity, we can talk about how it manages complexity. So Jem Young, who spoke yesterday, gave a talk in the spring that really affected me, where he talked about how software architecture is really all about the intentional management of trade-offs. And I was like, wow, that's so true, especially with CSS. So when you're dealing with like really large apps, like the opportunity is to sort of cleanly and easily have across the board reductions in complexity kind of go away. And what becomes more important is how that complexity is distributed. And functional CSS kind of takes a pragmatic approach in this regard by recognizing that complex style sheets are kind of hard to scale. So it just says, cool, we're going to pull complexity out of the style sheet then, and we're going to put that complexity in markup. So we're redistributing the complexity out of a style sheet, which can be hard to manage, and into a component system, which is a little bit easier to manage. You can create layers of abstractions from like low-level components up onto higher-level components to sort of keep that complexity away from your sort of day-to-day activity. Next, functional CSS is highly decoupled. Something that we don't talk about, I think, often enough in the front-end community is how traditional semantic or like BEM-like CSS couples the idea of style and components. So if you look at this component here, this link bar component, that link bar component is called its name because that's the name of its CSS class. But that class is also applying styles. So we're marrying these two concepts together, and we can't remove them. Like link bar, the name of the CSS class is defining what the component does, what its role is, what its job is, and it's also applying styles. These two things are now linked. Whereas with functional CSS, they're completely decoupled. We leave it up to a component system to decide what the name of the component is and to decide what the component's job is and how it's used. And then your CSS is just a set of utilities that's only in charge of styling and has nothing to do with inferring meaning for a component, which is really nice. And finally, it's team-oriented. So show of hands, who works with developers who aren't CSS focused? And keep them up if they contribute CSS code. And keep them up if that code is often instant technical debt. Honestly, I can't actually see if there are hands, but this has definitely been the case for me and has created a lot of problems on teams, and it's created sort of unhealthy interpersonal relationships where CSS-focused developers end up being like the CSS police or the CSS janitor instead of everybody being equal contributors to how the UI is written. I think that it's worth kind of recognizing that CSS expertise is rare, and not always in a good way. That CSS takes a tremendous amount of time and effort to develop that expertise. And more and more, it's not becoming it's not the most emphasized part of the curriculum of people in computer science programs or coming out of coding boot camps. So it's becoming more and more rare, even as CSS gets more and more complicated to work with. So that's how we're entering the situation where we have UI developers who are not CSS focused and struggle to write scalable CSS. Functional CSS unencumbers our teammates by reducing the amount of CSS you have to know from the whole wide world of all the CSS in the universe down to just this small basket of utilities that you've created for your app. So you don't have to know all of CSS anymore. You just have to understand the utilities at your disposal and how to apply them to get the effects that you want. So it creates this nice sort of like gateway and entryway process into understanding CSS rather than just being thrown into the deep end before you have a full understanding of how everything works. So I think those are the points of how functional CSS is really good for large apps. But I don't think I'd be doing a good job if I didn't talk a little bit about how you can bring this home and integrate this at your own company or on your own app. So the million-dollar question, is functional CSS for you? Maybe. Maybe not. So confession time, I don't use functional CSS for everything. Heck, I don't even use functional CSS for most things. Like the core advantage of functional CSS is that you can write UI components without writing new CSS. Well, if I'm working on like a side project or something small, maybe I want to write CSS. Maybe that's what I feel like. So in order to decide whether functional CSS is a good fit for a project, I tend to ask 3 questions. The first one is, does CSS ever feel like a stumbling block? Do you ever deal with like specificity wars or accidental overrides or something like that? And does it feel this way frequently? Is it something you have to deal with once in a while, or is it once a week, once a month, a couple weeks? And if it is frequent, I ask the third question. Are you using components? Is the app complicated enough to either already have a component system or merit the inclusion of component system? And if these 3 things are true, then I think functional CSS makes a good fit. So where do you go from there? Well, you could use assembly. Like this is a thing you could do. Assembly is completely open source, and you can clone the project, edit some data files, and pump out CSS with your brand colors, your fonts, your breakpoints, your sizing, and everything customized just for you. But there are a couple caveats to that. Assembly was always made for Mapbox first and for the open source community second. It's primarily a Mapbox tool, which means that there will always be assumptions built in that suit our use case and may not suit yours. Assembly may be more than you need or not enough, which is why I would say that if you're excited about functional CSS and you want to experiment with it, I feel like it's worth taking the time to make a system to fit your needs. And creating your own functional CSS system isn't as huge an undertaking as you might think. What I'd do is take a day and create utilities for layout, type, and colors. Excuse me. Create utilities that set breakpoints, set sizing, margins and padding, that set your font hierarchy of sizing in different types of font faces, and colors, background colors, and text colors, and recognize that the rest of your UI kind of flows from these core things. You don't have to take a month and convert your whole app all at once. You can go component by component. Like once you have this core set of utilities, go to the first component you want to port over, look at its CSS definitions, go into its class, and start breaking out those individual lines and turning them into utilities. And you'll find that as you go on, you'll have to write fewer and fewer utilities to port UI components over, and it will accelerate as you make progress. This is also a great opportunity to set guardrails. So if you've decided, sitting down with your coworkers, that in your design functional CSS system, your sort of medium font size is going to be 22 pixels. And then you run into a component that has a font size of 23 pixels. Well, this doesn't mean that you make a new utility that says font size 23. This is an opportunity to consistify your design and convert that to use what's like already been decided as should be the medium font size. So you'll find that as you go through this process, your design will get better and more consistent. So in conclusion, let go of your preconceptions. Functional CSS is a little weird, but it's not the devil, it's not crazy, and it really, really does work, especially for large apps. What makes it really cool is that it really puts reuse and decoupled freedom before everything else. It's all about writing CSS once and using it over and over and over again, completely decoupled from your situation, your page, or your components. And really its main superpower is that it enables you to write UI without writing new CSS, allowing you to move really, really fast and stay consistent at the same time. If you want to adopt functional CSS, awesome, that's great. But don't settle for something off the shelf. Don't just grab assembly or tachyons or atomic.css. It's worth taking the time to create your own system because nobody knows your app, your circumstances, and indeed your users quite like you do. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eli. Just one question, please. One question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yusuf Daniju. So the question is, if one is going with functional CSS, you talked about the inadequacy of CSS expertise. So if you have all these classes already available on a team, what we notice is that new developers joining the team, they just take the classes and use them straight away. At the end of the day, it usually leads to the same problem we were talking about. They don't become experts in CSS at the end of the day. They just pick the classes and just put them in. So they know how, for example, it works on Mapbox, but when they move to another team entirely, they lack that CSS expertise we are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point. I think that, like, at a certain level, there's always going to be a line between, like, are we enabling our teammates to be productive, or are we helping grow them as CSS developers? And, like, really, our priority has to be first shipping code for our app. And, like, it's important to support your teammates in their growth as CSS developers, but they also have to take some ownership of their own growth and their own trajectory in that way. And I don't think there's any, like, real silver bullet for getting somebody excited about CSS besides not immediately intimidating them. And allowing a more simple introduction might help nurture that curiosity. But, like, for real, like, I don't know if this really happens without that curiosity.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Eli. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, okay, just before I introduce the next